My name is Damodaran and I am the Chairperson of Excellence Enablers. This conversation is part of a series of conversations. It is a new initiative of Excellence Enablers to bring to you persons who've been there, done that, who have acquitted themselves very creditably even by the high standards, added value in whatever they have chosen to do and which they are continuing to do, and to share with you some of the insights that are not in the public domain. These are persons who don't talk about themselves. These are persons whose work talks on their behalf. You don't see them as often as you would like to in the front pages of newspapers, because that space is meant for people who have yet to walk through. That's the kind of persons that we are bringing to you in this conversation, and our intention is to ensure that there are takeaways for all of us from the way they go about doing what they do, the values that they bring to what they do, the results that they achieve with fairness and transparency as their guardrails. So to this conversation, I have great pleasure in welcoming a person who is the MD and CEO of the mothership, if I can call it that, of a large diversified group, referred to as a federation. It's a very rare usage as a federation, which has shared values, shared concerns, shared goals, and yet to have the constituent units functioning autonomously. And the person at the head of the mothership obviously has to drive the right synergies to extract the maximum value. Great pleasure in welcoming to this conversation Dr. Anish Shah, MD and CEO of Mahindra Mahindra. Let me start, Anish, with the question that might shed some light on what many people don't know. In fact, I stumbled on it myself. We all identify with institutes of higher education that we went to. And many people say that I'm a product of this institute, that institute. You, in more senses than one, are a product of IIM Ahmedabad. Both your parents went there. Was there any parental pressure guiding you in that direction?
So, Mr. Damodaran, first, it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you today. And with regard to your question, yes, my father was in the first batch at IIM Ahmedabad. My mother was in the second batch. There was absolutely no pressure from them. I had visited the campus when my cousin and her fiance were at the campus in 1985, and I fell in love with the place. And since then, it was my goal that I should go to IIM Ahmedabad. And 7 years later, or rather 5 years later, I got admission there and graduated 7 years later.
You fell in love with the buildings, and it must have hurt you when you heard a few years ago that on grounds of safety, they wanted to pull down some of those historic buildings. Even those of us who have not studied them but have made occasional visits, in some context or the other, have fallen in love with the buildings. Because I'm not an architect, I don't pretend to understand, but the feeling of space that you get in that area, if you take it and put it anywhere else, and you'll discover that that space, which I think promotes the right climate for learning, you don't see that.
That's exactly right. There's a charm.
There is a charm.
And that charm, I'm glad they've decided to maintain that charm.
Okay. Your father was the founder of the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance, and he fought several battles within and outside India in international fora for the benefit of the pharma industry in India. So some of that combative spirit must have rubbed on at some stage, would you think?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And in many ways, I'm following his footsteps because he worked with Pfizer, a multinational, for the first half of his career, and then spent the second half of his career really helping Indian pharma companies gain center stage on the world stage. And in many ways, I spent the first half of my career with multinational companies, and the second half is with the Mahindra Group, and contributing to the Mahindra Group taking the world stage and making us proud as Indians for an Indian company to be able to develop products, to be able to lead various aspects of governance and environment and social across the world.
Honestly, that commonality didn't strike me, that your career in some sense matched what your father did in the pharma industry. You started with Bain. You were there for a couple of years, I think, as senior consultant. 8.5 years in GE in two different spells, including 5 years as the CEO and president in India. In between 2 years at Bankam, I'm trying to understand that, why you went to Bankam, came back to GE, and then 7 years with the Mahindra Group. What are the different kinds of challenges as a consultant, as somebody, as you said, in an entity that is not Indian, and now 7 years in senior positions, rising to the top position in what is an essentially Indian company?
So let me explain Bankam as to how that came in between. I spent my first 9 years at GE, and the person who had hired me had left GE 7 years before I did. And she kept trying to get me to Bank of America every year for those 7 years. And finally, it was a great role, a business that had $2.5 billion of revenue, 80% profit margin, so $2 billion of net profit, with a 15% growth rate, and experience in retail banking, an offer that was very difficult to refuse. So I went there, and in a couple of years got a call back from GE, essentially saying, your dream role's open. A friend of mine called me at 7 a.m. and said, Anish, your dream role's open. Do you want to come back? And that was heading GE Capital India, because I always wanted to come back to India, and that was a great path to do so. So my quick response was yes. And 10 days later, I had the offer letter in my hand, and soon thereafter came here. So that is where Bank of America came in between. But beyond that, to your question, the set of experiences over the years has been very diverse. From Bain and Company, where I worked across 10 different industries in a short span of less than 3 years, to GE, where I ran marketing, product development for a large GE business, eventually ran a global business across 30 countries, to Bank of America, running a fairly large business for the bank, and then coming back into a very difficult environment where GE Capital India had gone through lots of challenges, and the mandate was really to turn around the business. And that all taught me various different things that prepared me for this role at the Mahindra Group.
Interesting that I was reading somewhere that friend of Anand's told Anand, you got to meet this young man. And Anand said, after hearing about what you've done, I might not have a role for him. And he was told, it doesn't matter, you meet the person. I was reminded of what Ramcharan said in some other context. Find a good person, you get him the role, you can think of. Don't let go of good persons, they're hard to find. And I'm glad that Anand accepted that offer. But moving away from that, I was interested in the subject of your doctoral thesis. CEO pay versus performance. I know that some years ago, it was a very major area of concern for the US securities market regulator, saying his CEO compensation, his executive compensation, a major worry. Is it getting completely out of alignment with what CEOs are expected to do? But I expect your doctorate came even earlier, prior to when that occupied center stage. So why did you choose this topic? Did you get the feeling that there was overcompensation, less compensation, no linkage to performance?
So I must say that I take very little to no credit for my PhD or my focus on governance. All the credit goes to my advisor for that. I had two advisors. I had started research in finance, in capital structure, dividend policies, and as part of that had created a lab network where it was essentially a stock market game, We had traders and we had CEOs. And this was in the early to mid 90s, well before the time when you had even computer networks in one lab. And it generated a lot of interest across the university. We used the game to also have students come in and take a course in corporate finance. And I used that for my research. And one of the professors who came in to see it was the retired president of Carnegie Mellon, Dr. Richard Syed. And he saw this and he said, can you add directors to this model? And I want to start looking at corporate governance in a different way. And I also want to start looking at CEO compensation. He and a number of other professors had collected data on CEO compensation in the US for the last 20 years. And he said, as part of, you're giving us this game, you can take this data and use it to enhance your research. So that's how we introduced directors. We looked at performance of companies and how they would differ if directors were larger shareholders versus directors appointed by the CEO, and looked at various different aspects of governance. So Dr. Syed and Dr. Shamsundar, who was my primary advisor, were the ones that really helped shape this. So my contribution was the game, and their contribution was a thought process around corporate governance, which I benefited a lot from.
I will come to American football a little later, but clearly they gave you the ball and said, take it.
That's right.
Okay. Now in India, there is some focus on compensation, but in the recent past, it's all been on independent director compensation. Are these a bunch of guys and women who are coming there, having a good time, going back, well compensated, not adding much to what the company needs them to add to? There's a focus. In fact, the word that was used was, are they being pampered? This was day before yesterday in one of the business papers, major story. What is your experience? Independent directors, do they add the kind of value that you as a chief executive would like them to add in your board?
Independent directors play a very critical role. The key question is, are they allowed to play that critical role? What we've seen in the Mahindra Group is they've added tremendous value. And I've seen that on the board of 5 different listed entities in the Mahindra Group. Actually 6 different listed entities with the latest one that I've got on. And in every entity, our independent directors will bring up some very meaningful topics, will essentially provide a mirror sometimes for the CEO to say, are you doing what makes sense? Have you considered everything here? And there are many conversations we will have that are, sometimes difficult conversations as well, because they pose some very difficult questions, but important questions, and ones that are very insightful based on their experience. So across our boards, we've seen the independent directors play a very important role. And the philosophy of the group has been that we have to be completely open in terms of putting everything on the table for a decision, and then jointly making that decision as to whether it makes sense for the company or it does not. I think that philosophy is one that brings out the best in independent directors and brings out the best in terms of what they can contribute.
So what I hear you say is that they can add value provided management creates the circumstances in which you can extract that value for them.
That's exactly right.
You give them the opportunity, recognize that they bring value to the table and extract it. Don't allow them to remain just, occupants of the boardroom seat.
That's right. And we have made decisions different from what we had planned for, based on input from independent directors across many of our companies.
Let's move to technology. I know that this is an area which you're passionate about. How do you use technology in business? All this talk about people saying we must turn digital, barely knowing what the spelling of digital is, but everybody wants to. become yesterday's digital champions. So as a genuine champion of technology, of the movement to make this country move in the direction of digital, where are we? What do we need to do to be where we should be?
I believe this starts with the consumer. What value is a company delivering to the consumer? And is that something that meets their expectations or exceeds their expectations? Technology is an enabler to do that. So I've always believed that it's not technology for the sake of technology, but it's really looking at how can we transform the experience we can deliver to a consumer, the product that we can deliver to a consumer by leveraging technology. And what we've seen is if we don't leverage technology, others will do that to give the consumer a much better experience or a much better product. And therefore, to be able to succeed, to be able to exceed expectations, we have to embrace technology and be at the cutting edge. A lot of innovation today is driven with the help of technology. Not entirely, but for the most part. And to be able to be in the driver's seat, it's something that we have to embrace. And this is something that I've also learned over time, that it's not about the fact that you must be a technical expert or frankly, even be an engineer. I have not been an engineer, and I was quite amazed a few years ago after we had started the digital journey in Mahindra to read the Economic Times as they called me a technologist. That was something I was very honored by. I didn't quite feel I had merited that term, but it was one that essentially was a testament to the fact that you don't need to be a technical expert to be able to embrace something that can add value for the business and for the consumer. And that's something that I think is essential for our leaders today.
Tell us something about your strategy group, 45-member strategy office, which becomes your instrument of ensuring synergies, of ensuring that the right pace, the right direction, the right kind of things are acted into the growth. How does this group work? How do you pick people for this group? I know somewhere you said, again, going back to your favorite game of American football, you said, pick the right people. That's the starting point.
Yes.
How does this work? This group, do other people see, if I may put it bluntly, do other senior persons in the various group companies say, there's a bunch of guys coming in from the outside telling us how to do our job. We've done that yesterday and the day before, and we'll do tomorrow also. So what's the big deal?
So many years ago, prior boss of mine had told me, you're as good as your team. And that's something I've never forgotten. So even as I came into the strategy role almost 7 years ago, the first thing was to build a very strong team. We started with core strategy, expanded to synergy, then digital, then data sciences. And the approach we used with businesses was, here's a team that can help you transform, that can help you really drive one of the top 2 or 3 initiatives that you have. But we will do so only under certain conditions. So it was entirely a pull model. None of the businesses were pushed to say, here's a team that you must use. Because I've always believed that to be successful, you have to add value. And if you add value, there will be a pull. So our leaders, as you asked, were never put in a position where they had to use this group. But what very quickly happened was, as they saw the talent in the group and the change that it could drive, there was a very strong pull. And there was always a 6 to 12 month waiting period for them to be able to get resources from the group. Yes, we would prioritize and put it on projects that had the highest value. But it really generated a lot of interest. And the other factor that helped was we did this to bring in the best people from the outside and introduce them to the group where they could join group companies after that. So if someone came in and 3 months into their role, they got an offer from a group company and they were happy to go there, they were free to do so. There was no limitation of time that you must be here for 3 years before you can move. The goal was to create the best talent across the group. And this was a great way for people to come in, for our companies to test that talent as they worked with them on specific projects, and then to be able to pull them in. So that's what our businesses liked as well, because they had access to the best talent, and that best talent could actually start working with them whenever they wanted to.
Interesting. And now I can't keep you away from my question on American football. Whenever when I use the words American football, that football sticks in my throat because I am a lifelong football fan of another kind, which America calls soccer and the rest of the world calls football. Okay. But I have on occasion seen snippets of games, etc. And initially, I used to think that brawn was much more important. Till I discovered, no, it's not that. There's a lot of strategy. There is a lot of brain that goes into this. And among the most celebrated coaches was New Proctor, not a very built man himself, who I am sure made up for size by speed, as he claimed when he was looking for peace. What are your takeaways from the game of American football or any other sport into the corporate arena? What are the influences, the positive factors that make one a better corporate contributor if one has been closely following sports participating?
So let me talk about my association with American football. I learned the game when I went to Pittsburgh for my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, and really got completely hooked on the game because it's a very complex game, actually. It's one that has various nuances to it. And once you understand the nuances, the level of strategy is very deep. But beyond the strategy, the most important part is teamwork. And that is essential to success. Now, the team in Pittsburgh was the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Pittsburgh Steelers were one of the best teams in football over the years. They had won the most number of Super Bowls. And one of the years I was there, they were back in the Super Bowl. And the Steelers had a very simple philosophy, which is we will build a team that works together. And we will not have superstars who are individual contributors, because we believe that the team has to work together to succeed. So if you would look at many of the Steelers team members, they were very good, obviously, but they were not the superstars that many of the other teams had. But despite that, they found a way to get the team to work together to really do extremely well. And that's something that I've always believed. Again, you're as good as your people, but it's not about bringing in individual contributors. It's about collaboration. And that's one philosophy, again, I've followed across my career, which is how can the team work together? How can they help each other succeed? So that's one big analogy I take away from sport, which is working as a team and working to help each other succeed, because the end goal is for the team to succeed, not for an individual to succeed.
Well, that's true. In fact, it's amazing how some of the language of sports finds its way into the boardrooms. I've heard, for example, people that hold forth in board meetings being described as Monday morning quarterbacks, which is, unless one has followed the game, you don't know what is, and that the fact that the games are played during the weekend. So on Monday morning, if you're a quarterback, clearly you're not in the field. You're espousing things that you don't believe in. That is a very interesting thing. One other area I wanted to touch on is many people talk about transformation. Now, I've always believed that there are three stages. There is growth, which you can also talk about in terms of incrementalism. Don't tinker too much with it, move it a little bit, which is what 80% of the people like to do, and they think that they've introduced a revolution there. There is transformation, and then there is metamorphosis where you don't recognize the original object. So do you think corporates should stop with transformation, or should they reinvent so well that they are not recognized in terms of what their preceding avatars were?
I would say that depends on the industry and depends on the forces that are driving the industry. So even within the Mahindra Group, we are using all of those. There are some businesses where we've got a very strong leadership position. It's about maintaining that, but maintaining that one cannot stay constant, because if you're constant, it's sort of the beginning of the end. So you have to be aggressive, you have to grow, but that may not require a significant transformation. And there are businesses that can lead a significant transformation in their industry to grow ahead. So I would say it depends on which industry you're in and what stage that industry is in.
So we started this conversation talking about your father and what he did for the pharma industry. So I want to close this conversation by asking you a question about your mother.
Mm-hmm.
She completed her course from IIM, but didn't go for corporate jobs, decided that she would help the startup ecosystem create employment for people that otherwise would not have got employed. How much of that rubbed off on you when you look at the startups today in India? Some of them are prospering like there's no tomorrow. Some are floundering. You occasionally feel like, no, I need to reach out to these guys and tell them what I think they need to do differently, better.
So I would say a lot more than that has rubbed off, because she graduated from Ahmedabad in 1967, when there were 2 women in that batch. And she started her business soon thereafter. So one of the early entrepreneurs in India, and ran that business for a period of 30 years before she sold it, as my sister and I were both in the US at that point in time. So a number of things really stood out. One is the importance of diversity and the challenges that she's had to go through, not just at IIM, but also in terms of running a startup and running a business, which eventually became a reasonably sized business for that time. And the second is around the boldness, the courage to be able to take those steps. It was not easy to establish a startup at that point in time, let alone for a woman to establish a startup, and the courage to be able to do that. So a number of those things have stayed with me. And the third was also a balance for family and work life. One of the reasons she wanted to do a startup was to have some flexibility where she can be at home when my sister and I would come back from school, and therefore not take on a corporate role that may not allow that. So I think all of those things have stayed as values that have really shaped me in terms of who I am today.
So my last question to you is this. I know there's a lot on your plate. You have an organization that in some sense you need to reinvent. You have customers that have become far more demanding than they were in the past, etc. So how does Anish Shah relax?
First, with family. I've always tried to maintain that balance, even though I worked very hard over the years, but usually very hard on the weekdays. The weekends is when my kids and my wife had the ability to write my schedule and say, here's what you should do. So first, a lot of things as a family. Loved playing cricket, football, various other sports with my sons. Now they're older, they have a little less time, and they have various things that they're doing, but we still spend a fair bit of time together, watching movies, reading books, traveling, enough to keep me completely busy, even on weekends.
So let me give you unsolicited advice even as I sign off, which is that I discovered playing with children is fine. The minute you get to playing with grandchildren, when you get there, they reach a stage when they can make you look hopelessly out of it. I've been through that phase, trying to teach my grandson football, and I can tell you that the minute he started learning the basics, I was completely out of breath, out of date. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Anish Shah. Thank you for being a part of this program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here.